They left him where the sacks went to die, a small, hungry shape beneath the sour shadow of last week's bread and a newspaper that still smelled of someone else's Sunday. The sweepers had not meant cruelty. They had meant to make a problem smaller by moving it into the place that chewed unwanted things. But when the cat lifted his face, the refuse pit did a strange thing. It stilled as if the wind had heard a single question and paused to listen. His eyes were an argument without words, his breath a measured patience. Passers-by did not look down. They hurried as if pity clung like wet wool. Only the cameras, glass set by the market ledge watching everything, caught his smallness and kept a record of a choice that would unmake and remake 2 lives. This was not only cruelty but consequence, a small action that moved like an undertow through the riverside alleys. In that pause, before any footsteps bent toward him, a single question hung over the heaps. Who carries the poor in their waking, and who leaves them to sleep among the bones of yesterday? Someone, somewhere, would not forget him. Before the sun made the river silver, he would take the broom to the lane and move the small leaves as if arranging memories into piles. He had learned the economy of small acts after the house had become a single room with the echo of one voice. His wife had been the one who extended ordinary time. She remembered to light the back lamp when rain pressed on the panes. She coaxed seedlings from stubborn soil, and she folded sorrow into the pockets of everyday things so that the sorrow might be carried out of sight. Now the rooms kept their own hush. Even the clocks observed an etiquette of restraint. He rose because habit had the sturdiness of a worn path, and he tended the few errands that formed a day. In the mornings he swept, measured out tea for the neighbor's boy, and looked after the small municipal camera that hung like a quiet eye above the market lane. He had not meant to become a watcher. Once he had taught arithmetic to the children who came to the after-school table, and his hands remembered chalk as if it had lived on them. After she died, nights thickened into a kind of weather. He found that being near the camera soothed him, for the camera kept records without asking why. So he learned slowly to watch. The camera's light gave a ledger of the ordinary. Children running, crates moved, sacks left and taken. It kept the ledger the world thought it might lose, and in that keeping he discovered a strange consolation. The quiet fact that something would remember what had happened, even when he could not. The cat entered the ledger without fanfare. For 3 nights, a pale, thin shape had come to the edge of the lane and peered as if testing the volume of the world. It paced, sniffed, and withdrew when footsteps approached. It did not mew like a plea, but walked with a small dignity, as if each motion conducted a private music. The man watched, first out of idle interest, then with a hunger that surprised him. Watching another small life arrange itself by the basil plant his wife had tended felt like watching a memory make itself present. The animal's ways, the way it paused at the scent of oil, the way it tucked itself beneath the corrugation of a roof, spoke of survival as a practiced art. He learned its hours and named them in his head: the slow arrival, the patient stakeout, the hush when rain made the lane a soft drum. He never described the cat to others. He found it simpler to attend to its ways. It came at dusk and pressed itself against the shadow where the basil buckled toward the sun. It crouched and listened to the lane with a mien of one who expected the world to behave according to known rules. When mice dared the open, it was there, patient and unhurried, taking its food like a gentleman who refuses to be hurried by fear. Once it sat squarely upon the slightly chipped stone at his doorstep, the stone with the crescent mark his wife had liked, and turned its face toward the small green of the pot, as if offering thanks. The man saw in these motions not a random animal, but a creature with a ritual and a vocabulary of tenderness that matched some of his own. The basil itself had become a relic and a liturgy. His wife had named the plant with a soft, intimate word and had taught the man to turn its soil, to pinch its leaves, to speak to it in small, practical phrases. The plant would shiver in the afternoon breeze as if in response to a hymn, and the man tended it because tending brought the illusion of agency. The cat honored the herb in the way a traveler might show reverence to a remembered shrine. It would circle once, rub its whiskers along the pot's rim, and then sleep with its paws arranged in a geometry that seemed to say, "Here I am and I am content." In the plant's green, the man found a stubborn ally against the erosion of memory. People in the lane had their opinions, the fishmonger declared, with the finality of someone who works beside things that die and are made useful, that strays heralded change. The tea woman, generous with scraps and advice, said, "Cats choose their people as wind chooses a field." The neighbor's boy, who loved trouble and flour, left out tiny tidbits that the cat accepted with the economy of a critic. The man absorbed these remarks without answering. He had become careful with his words. Grief had taught him that to speak sometimes invited a version of the world he did not wish to meet. So he watched instead, and watching made him feel both the impotence and the possibility of his days. At night he rewound the camera's footage, not to catch the image of the cat so much as to see how it moved within the city's small geometry. The camera showed more than sight. It recorded the habits of the place. Once he watched a woman move along the lane carrying a wrapped bundle. She paused, surveyed the refuse and shifted the load, tucking it in the way someone might tuck a child against a shawl. She dropped something by the sacks, and the camera recorded the act with indifferent accuracy. On the recording, the movement was quick and small, but the implication lingered. The man found himself pressing the playhead again and again, not out of curiosity alone, but because the recorded night had become a question addressed to his palms. Why choose the refuse pit for a living thing? The question lodged like a small stone against his ribs. There is a cruelty to that sight beyond neglect. It is where the world lays down what it no longer wishes to consider. The thought felt to him uncomfortably intimate. He carried a life flattened into a new geography, and thus found a kinship with discarded things. The cat's appearance on both screen and lane made the world insist upon an answer that felt communal in its demand. He could imagine the woman's motives, hasty, frightened, practical, or imagine worse. But the camera showed only motion and left the meaning to those who would give it a meaning. Before long, the cat drew nearer, until the distance between his doorstep and the basil pot was the span upon which their relation was measured. It moved in the small arithmetic of animal logic, a test, a retreat, a return, and then the slow laying down of trust. One drizzled dark evening, it took shelter under his awning and washed its forepaws in a manner that made the man laugh out loud at himself for feeling possessive of an animal that had not promised him anything. He left a saucer on the stoop and watched the cat lap with such deliberation that the action seemed like a ritual. Each time it came and left, the ritual accumulated like a small, binding stitch. The camera, indifferent as any machine, had its testimony. Hands and shadows, bundles dropped and taken. The repetition of small acts that become the grammar of a community. For him, the footage was transmutation. It turned everyday choices into moral questions. Each replay drew a new color out of his accustomed quiet. He began to map possibilities. Call the shelter, find someone to take it, or bring the animal inside. The choices lay before him like stones on a path, some heavy, some light, and he weighed them with the slow deliberation of a man unused to haste. Neighbors pressed advice with the clumsy mercy of those who mean well. The tea woman said, "Animals know good souls," and the fishmonger grunted something about luck. Kindness is often the currency of small places, and he accepted it with a reserved gratitude. Yet he understood that to invite another creature inside was to redraw the map of his solitude. Responsibility in the household sense is a shape that takes time to hold and to honor. He had arranged his grief into habits that were themselves a kind of fortification. Admitting an animal into that tidy defense would be to invite an unpredictable weather. One morning, the inciting event flared into the light of a day no longer ordinary. He rose to sweep and found the alley threaded with the slow shuffle of a small assembly. Neighbors leaning from doorways, a municipal truck gone on, and a woman standing with the hard softness of one who had acted and could not undo. The cat moved between boxes as if tracing the route of its coming, and when he put down his broom, it approached his boots and looked up as if in recognition. In that look, something asked him to answer. He had come to measure his life in objects and motions. Now an animal's need presented itself as a question that involved not only him, but the street that had seen the act. The inciting incident, then, was not merely the captured sequence on a strip of recorded night. It was the way that sequence had returned to his doorstep in daylight with a small heart, waiting to be taken in. He reached out his hand. The cat, without ceremony, lifted its cheek to his palm and stayed there. The simple compact of flesh and fur against his skin claimed him with a clarity harsher than any argument. Responsibility had been placed into his hands. In the hush after that small ceremony, the man understood that his ordinary world had been rearranged. He had been the keeper of a last cup, a mender of minor things, a man who arranged memories into piles to keep the tide at bay. Now the tide's edge had crept closer because an animal had claimed him, and in claiming him it offered the possibility of repair. Whether that repair would be steady or undone by future storms he could not yet say. But the line between before and after had been drawn by a paw upon his palm. The inciting event had arranged itself like the first wind of change, small, undeniable, and carrying with it the demand that he answer. If this gentle story touched your heart, subscribing keeps this quiet little corner alive. The lane grew teeth. Not the cruel teeth of men, but the small, precise teeth of rumor. A sound that nibbles at a calm, and in doing so reveals what the calm was hiding. News is a slow animal. It walks at first, then it runs, and when it runs, it takes the shape of many feet. The little camera above the market lane had done what cameras do. It kept a ledger. But when the ledger was shown to those who liked to read the world aloud, the lane became a page. People came with their own interpretations. Their voices had the quickness of knives. Some called it mercy's failure, and some called it fate. Some, more bluntly, called it evidence of how disposable life had become. The cat sat on the stoop, unbothered by definitions, and licked the dust between its toes with the patience of a small sovereign. The man watched, and something inside him stretched like a repaired seam. Here was a life that asked nothing of him and yet made of his silence an obligation. What followed was a string of small violences and small mercies that would test the old man's hands in the secret ledger of his heart. The lane awoke to a new vocabulary, where before there had been small salutations and the commerce of what people owed each other. Now there were whispers of cameras and cruelty and a rumor that a woman had performed an ugly economy at the refuse pit. The market's ordinary day was the same. Tea steamed, fish flapped on ice, a child hawked oranges with a voice that belonged to someone assembling his future. But below this ordinary there were shifting currents. Words traveled like moths, light, distracting, persistent, and the cat sat in the midst of them like a coin on a piano, small, bright, and hard to ignore. The man found himself explaining nothing to anyone. He had never been good at speech. His wife's memory had taught him that words can be repaired only when honesty is the needle. So he did what he had learned to do. He acted. He fed the cat with water warmed a degree more than the air. He swept the stoop until it glowed like a modest altar, and he sat by the basil pot and listened to the animal breathe. In those breaths he found a kind of scripture, short clauses of trust and appetite and sleep. Each clause drilled a small hole in his solitude, but action calls answer, and the world was not without its answers. A woman from the neighboring block, young, quick-eyed, with a scarf knotted like a banner at her throat, arrived one morning holding a thin tablet that glowed with other people's faces. She introduced herself as Amina. She tended abandoned dogs and cats in the evenings, and word of mouth carried both her name and her tired, generous hands. She had seen the clip and would not let a matter of such appetite rest upon idle conscience. "We can take him to the clinic," she said, voice like a well-measured bell. "We can get him checked." "If you want," the man hesitated. He had counted pennies and found them finite. He had arranged his life so that surprises were as rare as thunder in summer. Yet when the cat brushed his leg and purred with the small, classical rumble that speaks of contentment, something in him answered. He turned the coin in his pocket, felt the ridge of its edge, and then said, "No, I will keep him here a while." Amina, unsurprised, nodded and left a small folded card. "If you change your mind," she said, "call. There are people who will help. There are people who will make it easy." The word easy has an elastic quality. When stretched across different lives, it reveals small tears. For the man keeping the cat was not easy. It was a decision that altered the arithmetic of his day. More bowls to wash, more attention required. A body that stayed in the house after the lamp was snuffed because an animal might need a hand. He found himself waking in a way he had not woken in months. At 4 a.m, he listened to the cat's breath and, in that listening, learned a discipline he had thought was lost. The simple readiness to answer another life. Not everyone welcomed this readiness. One afternoon, an official notice was tacked to the telephone pole outside the lane. Municipal regulation. It read in neat bureaucratic type, forbade keeping unregistered animals within the limits of certain housing. The notice was dry in its language, but wet with consequence. The landlord who shared the courtyard with the man, a man who had always had a practical view of comfort and law, muttered that the building could incur a fine. "Tenants are private ledgers," he said, "and the ledger must be kept tidy." The fishmonger spat his tobacco and said, It'll bring trouble. The tea woman, on the other hand, shrugged and offered another saucer in secret. The camera's footage had entered the world of people who need evidence before they will raise a hand. Someone had taken a grainy clip from the camera, sharpened it, and posted it on a local group. The clip spread like breadcrumbs. Small bits draw many mouths. People watched the woman drop what looked like a bundle near the refuse and the cat creep out and make for the basil. Their voices filled comment sections with judgment. Some called for punishment, some for rescue. Others criticized the camera itself. The man watched those comments with the same mixed feelings of a man looking through a window to see his life discussed in a cafe. He felt exposed and curiously fortified at the same time. A new figure entered the lane in the form of a younger reporter, a man with ink on his fingers and an eager, untrained kindness. He came with a notebook in the habit of asking questions that made answers unavoidably truer. "People want to know if you are the cat's owner," he said, face half hidden behind a good intention. "They want a story. I am his keeper," the man said. The word keeper carried more gravity for him than owner. Ownership is a claim of property. Keeping is the quiet act of custodianship. He explained haltingly the camera, the basil, the way the animal had arrived. The reporter's eyes brightened. Every public hunger becomes sharper when it touches a shuttered heart. He left promising to return with questions, and the promise fastened a new attention to the lane. The lane's attention bent into the shape of choices. A neighbor, Rafi, who had boots that loved puddles and a laugh that liked to be loud, complained about the smell of animals. "You'll draw rats," he said, not unkind but unhelpful. Rafi had always liked order. His life was built on the hinge of doing what his father had taught him, and on the certainty that other people's messes were not his problem. Yet Rafi's voice was not the only one. The boy who sold oranges whispered about a fundraiser in a school. The tea woman knitted stitches of support into cups of tea while looking at the man, as if she had always known he would break his silence. The man's hesitations were not only practical, but moral. Since his wife's passing, he had become practiced at not beginning things he could not finish. Love, he had learned, can be a heavy ledger to balance. Starting new obligations felt at times like opening a door to a cold draft. The cat's dependence was a tug upon him that might warm or might chill. He found himself arguing with his own hand. What if this obligation names him? Could he be the kind of man who would take this small creature's life into his house and heart, and keep to the work through illness, through need? The surveillance footage, merciless to context, attracted unexpected attention. A local social worker, hearing of the clip, arrived with forms and a soft, invasive concern. She spoke of community standards and health codes and asked if he intended to register the animal. Her questions were like small knives, practical, clean, and leaving only necessary wounds. She suggested surrender to a shelter for a while. Perhaps there the cat could find a home free of local constraints. The man declined. Surrender felt too much like giving up on an answer he had just found. As the week uncoiled, the cat became a presence in the man's routines like a repeated refrain in a song. It slept at the foot of his bed and woke with a modest hunger that taught the man to move his joints in new ways. He walked it, in a fashion of words, by offering small plates on the stoop and by being there when the night was thick. People began to speak differently about him. Their whispers acquired a soft respect as if the act of keeping had made him less ghost and more citizen. The camera recorded all of this, trivial scenes of feeding and a hand over fur. But it was the human heart that took the footage into account, rearranging its measures. Between these modest changes, a new complication entered: a vet bill. The cat, when taken under Amina's small care, revealed a raggedness. Old wounds healed poorly, a spot of infection behind an ear, the faint, familiar smell of fleas. The man fished coins from jar and pocket and learned anew the arithmetic of care. The vet, a woman with steady hands and the habit of speaking to creatures as if they held the secret of the world, cleaned the wounds and gave instructions for medicine. "He's older than he looks," she said, half to the man and half to the animal. "He has been rough-handled. He'll need rest." Rest was not that easy to provide in a lane that was itself restless. Neighbors argued for different solutions. Some wanted to hide their heads and pretend nothing had occurred. Others wanted to put the affair before the municipal council. The man found himself under a new kind of scrutiny. He was a man with an animal, and people's neat social list required those anomalies be addressed. The camera's clip had been both proof and provocation. It proved that someone had acted badly, and it provoked the neighborhood to choose a seat in the theater of public opinion. The reporter returned with questions sharpened into demands. He asked whether the man would allow an interview to be published. Language, the man found, cuts both ways. Spoken words can loosen or tighten a knot. He consented because the cat's presence had already made him tired of silence. The piece ran with a headline that wanted to be shocking but settled for true. Dumped at the dump, an old man's soft answer. Comments surged like tide. Some readers praised. Others accused the man of hoarding animals. The story made friends and enemies of people who had never been to the lane. Two forces then pressed toward one another, the momentum of public kindness and the machinery of public rule. A petition started by a neighbor asking the municipal office to recognize the man's care-gathered signatures. The petition called for help, for subsidies for a proper registration of the animal or for relocation assistance. At the same time, a complaint had been lodged by an unknown tenant who feared fines. The municipality, which finds strength in its formalities, responded to both with letters and an inevitable official who liked order more than improvisation. Mr. Qureshi, who wore his municipal uniform like a second skin, arrived one gray morning with a clipboard and shoes that had seen better cobbles. He spoke in the cool language of procedure. Forms, follow-up, potential penalties. "Sir," he said, "we have complaints." His eyes, however, betrayed a curiosity that was not strictly procedural. He had seen, as had many, the video online. He had read the comments. Yet where the public saw scandal, he saw questions that fit into his ledger: responsibility, ownership, compliance. The man tried to explain the small ethics of keeping. "He is not a nuisance," he said softly. "He is company." Mr. Qureshi nodded, and his pen made tidy marks across paper. The man offered paperwork from the vet, a small receipt, a note that the cat had been treated and vaccinated. Yet the municipal officer had been instructed to act on complaints. His duty was a straight road. He issued a notice: register the animal within 7 days or the city would remove it for examination, possibly placing it in the municipal shelter. The notice was a hammer. It fell with the light, indiscriminate weight of law. The man read it as if reading some new weather report. He stroked the cat, who purred and blinked as if laws were a distant, dull fact. He resolved to register the animal. Registration required documents and time. Both were in short supply. He found himself in the paradox of small courage. To continue keeping the cat, he would need the assistance of many small hands and the generosity of the bureaucracy he had never wished to enter. To make matters more tangled, the surveillance footage offered a second revelation. A neighbor with sharper eyes took the original clip and, with help, managed to enhance a frame. The woman who had left the bundle was clearer in this new image. A face turned from the lens, but with an identifiable scar on her cheek and a distinctive scarf. She had been seen before, the neighbor said, in other lanes carrying other bundles. The implication thickened into alarm. What if this was not a single act of callousness but a pattern of abandonment? Who else had been left? Where had other creatures been placed? The idea of a pattern moved like a shadow through the community. Amina, the rescue worker, took the matter seriously. She spoke of networks and cases and the hunger that returns when small mercies are not attended to. "We must follow the pattern," she said, and used words the man had not heard in such an earnest form before: to prevent. She organized a small group of volunteers to watch the refuse pit at night. They borrowed a cheap lamp and took shifts like sentinels around a city within a city. The man watched them plan with a mixture of gratitude and a new unease. To watch is to invite attention, and attention in crowded places can be a kind of trouble. Then came the night that tipped quiet into alarm. The man, who had never been brash, decided to sit with the camera's laptop to catalog what they had: timestamps, patterns, small coincidences strung like beads. Around midnight, a light blinked on his screen. Motion at the refuse pit. Someone was there. The volunteer on watch, a thin woman named Salma, messaged a terse line: "She's here again." They did not rush like heroes. They moved with the more dangerous motion of ordinary men, who had decided to do one unusual thing. The volunteer team assembled at a respectful distance. The camera, their descent, kept time with a steady eye. The footage was small at first, a silhouette, a shape bending. A bag moved, a soft sound like fabric kissing the ground. The volunteers watched breathlessly, as if watching the weather change. they recorded. Then, in the flicker of the lamp, they saw something else. A municipal van idling at the far end of the lane, its driver waiting, lights off, as if someone had decided to move an inconvenient thing at an inconvenient hour. The implication was immediate and poisonous. If the van belonged to the municipality, then the act was not merely private cruelty but public complicity. People who should protect sometimes serve the convenience of disposal. That thought is heavy enough to silence even bold mouths. The volunteers watched the van in the footage as it drew away with a bundle. No faces were clear. The night had made itself an accomplice. Amina cursed softly, a sound that matched the sudden tightness against the man's chest. If the stake of the story had been arranging help for a single animal, it had become something larger, an argument about who had the right to dispose of lives and when. They took the enhanced footage to the municipal office. Mr. Qureshi, who preferred clean lines, paled slightly when shown the image of a municipal van in the company of the woman who left bundles. He made a sound like a man recalculating his route. "We will investigate," he said, and his voice had the exactness of an answer that must be given to a crowd in order to maintain order. But investigations, like clocks, are promises that move in their own time. The man, who had little patience for time that postponed action, felt the pressure of a choice: to wait for the apparatus of the city to turn, or to act with the small tools at hand. He chose to act. He began to take nightly walks by the refuse pit with a lamp and a bundle of kibble. He walked with a quiet resolve, the cat padding beside him under the small measured light of a lamp he had borrowed from Amina. They walked beneath a river of stars and watched for returns. It was during one such night watch that the lane's politics came to a head. A group of young men, part prank, part virtue, decided to make a live stream of the watch. Their phones glowed like a congregation. The city, which likes to believe itself governed by law, now found itself on display. The live comments were cruel in their speed: accusations, laughter, debate. Some asked why the man did not simply give the animal to a shelter. Others called for the woman who had been seen to be found and punished. The live stream turned the lane into a small amphitheater. Halfway through that restless watch, and here perhaps, the man recognized the peculiar hunger of a modern world that would rather watch than guard. A single voice rose in the live comments with a question the man felt like a needle. "Have you ever had an animal wait for you when you didn't ask them to?" The question landed in the night like wind on chimes. It was a soft interrogative that pried at the man's reserve. He thought of his wife's hands, of the basil that leaned toward sun, of the way the cat had come without demand, and he answered not in words, but with the simple movement of scooping the creature into his arms. That action, older than speech, answered more than any comment could. The commenters saw and softened. Sub-comments turned to memories of dogs at doorsteps and birds that had nested in eaves. The man felt less alone because strangers had a similar memory of an animal's quiet faith. The public attention had consequences. The municipal office, after its internal noise, sent a terse notice. An inspector would visit to clarify the situation and examine the footage. The man read the notice by the basil pot and felt the old fear tighten. The inspector would come with questions and possible penalties. The camera's footage had made him both a defendant and a moral exemplar. He had made a choice, and now the choice had a legal echo. On the morning before the inspector arrived, someone took the camera's housing and smashed it with a blunt instrument. The cameras, like small gods, punish in their silence. The man found the shattered glass and the camera's inert belly and felt his chest chill with a new fear. If surveillance, the very thing that had preserved the record of the woman's act, was destroyed, then there would be only version and accusation, and not the sober ledger of a thing that had been witnessed. He reported the vandalism, and Mr. Qureshi promised an inquiry. Yet the loss of the camera was not merely the loss of footage. It was also the loss of the feature that had knit the lane together in new ways. Without it, the rumor hunted in a darker mode. In this darker mode, men become bolder. The municipal van's implication grew from a suspicious image to an accusation that could no longer be easily disproved. The man who had tended basil to keep memory from eroding felt his small world hardening around him like a shell. That night, they gathered at the man's door with the cat asleep in his lap, a small, gentle weight. The volunteers and neighbors who still believed in the shape of mercy sat quiet. Amina had a list of names of people who might take the cat if he could not. It was a modest human protest against the idea that city processes are always just. They sat in the man's light and spoke in hopeful fragments about petitions and shelters and a lawyer who might take a local case pro bono. When the knock came at the door, it was neither time nor thing the man expected. He opened the door to two men in collected uniforms. Municipal, perhaps, but not the same as Mr. Qureshi's. They had the look of people whose job is not simply to ask questions, but to carry answers in the heavy way the city has allotted them. One of the men held a sealed envelope. The other had a badge that gleamed like a coin under a lamplight. Their faces were polite but precise. "Sir," the taller man said, his voice the size of a closed door, "we need to speak about the footage from the camera and the matter of the van." For a moment, the man thought of law and of patience and of waiting for the right moment to place a small kindness into the hands of an unprepared world. Then, as if the night chose its own movement, a sound like a dog's bark came from the street, and in that same breath a small, frantic movement at the corner of the doorway. The cat's tail twitched and it leaped forward with a sudden agility born of surprised fear. The taller man stepped quickly. One of his hands brushed not to harm but to steady the man. And in that instant the man's world made a decision he had not yet spoken into consequence. Behind the officers a light glowed that did not belong to the house. A van perhaps turning the corner. And with the step, the sealed envelope slipped like a leaf into the man's hand. On the front, in the tidy official script of a city that delegates itself through documents, his name was printed. The envelope was a pivot. It was both small and heavy, like the heart of a coin. He looked at the men and then at the assembled neighbors. Silence made its own language. They were about to read. They were about to be told whether the city's answer would be the hard, mechanical kind that obeys the letter of law without hearing the living syllables of life. The lamp glowed, the cat blinked, and the man felt as if in the knuckle of his arm, the ancient and frightful truth that sometimes justice arrives. Carrying a bill, they stood at the door with the envelope between them and the night waiting like a held breath, and in the thin space before the paper was opened, the man realized there were truths the envelope might contain and truths it might hide. The motion of his hand toward that paper was a point of no return. He had kept the cat this far. What lay behind the seal could take it further, or take it away. The camera had done its work. The city was now ready to do its. The street beyond the lane was a river of decisions, and the current had found them at last. At dusk, the lane kept its breath, and in that small pause, decisions were made. The cat who had been left beside the sack slept with the patience of one who remembers hunger, as if it were a history. The man who kept the basil and the quiet had learned to count days by small rituals, sweeping, naming, brewing tea, whispering to pots. The city's letter arrived like a weather, paperwork, a summons, a question of law and heart. Neighbors gathered, some with mercy, some with the sharpness of complaint. The camera was smashed, but the story had already walked away from its wreckage. A van had been seen at the refuse, and a woman with a scar on her cheek had been caught by an unreliable light. The lane argued itself awake. Who takes account, who keeps watch, and who decides the fate of small lives? The man felt the city close like a fist. He lifted the envelope, and everyone waited for the paper to speak. The night was patient. Somewhere van lights slid and closed. A choice hung between them like a thin coin. It could buy mercy, or it could cost them everything. The man breathed. They followed the van as if following a rumor that had grown limbs and feet. It moved with the slow assurance of municipal property. Clean paint, an emblem the volunteers had traced from the pixelated frame, and a license plate that, in daylight, seemed both ordinary and absurdly final. Amina drove, hands steady about the steering wheel, while the man and two volunteers kept pace on foot, ducking between the market stalls and the backs of buildings where the city's skin is thinner. Street by street, the van threaded itself toward the industrial edge, where the smell of burned paper and tired oil makes the earth smell older than the houses. The man kept thinking of simple equations. One small life taken multiplied by indifference equals a habit of throwing away. He thought of his wife's basil, and how small green things keep insisting on growth. They reached the compound as the sun splayed itself like a hand across the roof lines. A gate, painted a bureaucratic blue, stood between them and the place where the van stopped. The emblem on the side of the van matched the crest on the gate, municipal transport. An iron bell made a mechanical sound when Amina pressed it. Behind the gate a man came, not the clipped Mr. Qureshi, but someone older, his back a cadence of years at a desk. He looked at the van, at the man, at the small group that had gathered, and his face retained a neutrality that had the habitual heaviness of men who answer to many clocks. "Who are you?" he asked, and his voice was neither kind nor cruel. It was the voice of official machinery. "We're neighbors," Amina said. "We saw your van taking animals from the refuse pit. We have footage. We want to know what you do with them." The man felt his throat pushed toward a sharp politeness, the old instinct to explain, to make the city think him an ordinary citizen, rather than a stubborn keeper of a stray. He had the vet's receipt folded in his pocket like a private talisman, and the envelope that had frightened him still warm in his hand. People had come from the lane, some with stern faces, some with the softness of those who bring jam and tea to trouble. Their presence made a human fence about the small things being argued over inside municipal papers. The official considered them, then barked into a radio, a sound that caused a little iron hush to fall. Two uniformed men appeared, their boots making a dry punctuation on the yard. One of them opened the back doors of the van with the slow ceremony of someone who always does dangerous things in public. For a moment there was only a smell. Dry straw, oil, the remembered sweetness of cat fur. The man held his breath as if the air itself might determine what the city did next. They expected emptiness. An animal or two, perhaps, but not a crowd of small lives pressed into crates. But there they were, cats and a few dogs, blinking up at the sudden light with the weary astonishment of things lifted. The sight of so many living things in crates made a throat close with the peculiar pressure of moral counting. Each head was an account, each meow a complaint or a grace note. The man moved forward until he stood close enough to see the names and tags they had fastened to some crates. Numbers, dates, a small bureaucratic neatness applied to lives that did not fit neatness by temperament. "Why are there so many?" Amina asked, voice sharp with the sense that the city had been hiding something under ordinary paint. The official looked at the tags. "We collect strays," he said. "We take them to the processing center. They are then handled according to municipal procedure." The words were careful, as if the man wanted them to be both true and painless. "Processed?" the man echoed. The word clanged like a bell in a hall. A volunteer who had the soft face of someone who had read too much news clenched his jaw. "What does processed mean?" The official narrowed his eyes, and Mr. Qureshi, who had been summoned and now appeared like a man trying to unfasten his conscience from its clasp, replied, "It means cataloging for treatment or rehoming. There are regulations." "Rehoming," Amina said slowly. "How many were rehomed?" Her voice held a public impatience. "Some," said the official. "Some are rehomed. Others are held. Held. A word that invites imagination to do what law will not." The man felt the cat under his coat stir as if in answer. The smell of so many animals made a new kind of pleading that was not yet sharpened into a demand. Then a small thing stilled the hardening air, a sound like a thread pulled taut. From inside one of the crates a voice, thin, familiar, and small, made itself heard. The man walked on instinct and leaned down. A face under straw looked out at him, and his heart made a double motion, a recognition and a new sorrow. There, in a cramped space, a tabby that had been passed among alleys for years, one with a peculiar whirl of white on its chest, lifted its head and mewed as if finding a name. "That's mine," the man said, and his voice broke like a twig. He had seen many faces of animals, but this one matched an oft-remembered angle. The crease of fur at the temple, the right ear nicked by some long-ago scrape. He had the odd intimacy of those who keep things by habits. Sometimes memory keeps a creature like a coin in a pocket and discovers it by the way it clinks. The official's eyes flicked to him with the speed of someone cataloging a new complication. "You claim ownership?" "Not ownership," said the man. "Custodianship." He came to the doorstep and stayed. A silence arranged itself like a furniture moved for convenience. A voice from the back of the compound called for a ledger to be produced. Papers were moved, names read, numbers recited like a ritual of cleanliness. Mr. Qureshi's hand trembled a little as he pointed toward a printed list that matched tags to crates. The man read the list, and his eyes snagged on a sequence of numbers, and beneath them, a handwriting that cut like a knife, a signature he recognized at the edge of things. It was not the man's name, but the woman's. The one with the scar, the one caught on the camera. Her full name appeared there as an agent. The man looked up, feeling everything tilt. The woman who had been seen leaving bundles was not a stray neighbor but part of the municipal apparatus. The official sought to smooth the moment by teaching the clerk to speak in lower register. She is an employment contractor, he explained. She collects animals from certain areas. Collects? Amina repeated, the word posed like a challenge. You mean she takes them to you? She deposit them, said the official, careful as before. We follow established protocols. But the man's mind had taken a different geometry. The camera had shown a woman dropping a bundle. Other footage had shown a municipal van collecting bundles. The linkage between the woman's action and the van's arrival was now a thing in public. The lane's roomer had walked into the municipal yard and signed its name on a list. A neighbor thrust a phone forward, the tiny screen trembling. The live stream that had chased the van had recorded its route and shown corners where the van had stopped. Someone had matched the van's plate with the municipal registry. The official's face, which had begun in calm, folded in a manner that can be read as the moment when a man calculates the possible damage to a career. He called for a supervisor. Mr. Qureshi, whom the man had thought an ordinary clerk, looked at the pile of crates and then at the man with the basil-scented shirt and did a strange thing. He turned his back for a second and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small folded piece of paper and handed it to the man. It's a petition, he said, from inside. The man unfolded it with the caution of one opening a small coffin and read, a list of names, signatures scrawled in cramped hands. They were signatures of other municipal workers, drivers, clerks, signed beneath a plea. The wording was thin but resolute. We cannot continue to process animals in this manner. A few lines more. There are unofficial orders to clear strays to certain districts. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco and the self-respect of those who sign what they should not. The man inhaled the stale, human smell of complicity and fear. He had thought the city worked like a well-oiled clock. Here exposed, it was a machine with secret gears. The official's jaw tightened. This is an internal matter, he said. And the sentence contained the double will of men who hope to contain outrage in a single clause. Then make it public. Amina snapped as if the word public could sever the soft underbelly of necessity from the iron belly of law. The volunteers began to chant softly, names, accusations, requests. The compound's gate had become a stage. The man felt the heat of many small eyes watching him, waiting for the simplest movement that a man might make when he knows what is right. He stepped toward the van and placed his hand on the metal door. It was warm from sun and story. He could have demanded the release, taken the tabby and walked back down the lane as if the city's machinery had never been more than a nuisance. But that would have been a small victory. The problem would remain. He looked at the crates full of animals whose names were not yet offered. The man understood, with the clarity of someone who had spent nights holding hands in the dark, that this was not merely about a single cat. This was the place where a system either showed itself to be humane or revealed it would not be. I will not let you take them away, he said, voice low but steady. Not until there is certainty they will be safe. The official's face folded like a map under a finger. You cannot prevent municipal operations, he said, but his voice had lost the unambiguous authority of law. Then call your supervisor, Amina said. Call whoever signed these orders. Let them show their face. She reached into her pocket and dialed, and the sound of a ring in that small industrial yard had the sudden urgency of a court. A knot of men approached, the scene tilting toward argument. The man's chest filled with the smell of straw and the thin hope of rescue. He stood amid voices like a small islanding word. The official, having summoned a supervisor by the clumsy mercy of a phone, put one hand on the crates as if to check the screws. You make a spectacle, he said. This will complicate matters. We will make a spectacle, the man answered. We will make a spectacle of the law if it serves after night so long as it hides its hands. The supervisor arrived at last, a larger man in a suit, the kind whose buttons strain for reasons of good iron, and he had the look of someone who had been taught to believe in the sanctity of procedure over the small urgencies of flesh. He listened to the complaint, to the videotape played on a trembling phone, to Mr. Qureshi's petition. His face for a moment showed the faintest tilt of sympathy. Then his lips compressed and his hand went to a folder. He opened it and read, and the man felt time price itself into seconds. "We will do an internal audit," the supervisor said finally, and his voice had a measured brutality. "Until then, we must confine these animals. If you wish to contest, there is a procedure." "Procedure doesn't save lives," Amina said, and the sentence was the small truth of people who have worked in medicine, who see a body as thing worthy of urgent action, not merely paper. Men argued while the sun passed its hand across the yard. The man felt the strain of days. Legalisms had begun to bag the air. He watched as one of the drivers unfastened a tag and then, with a small human motion of shame, began to unhook the locks of a crate. The crate door opened and a cat, thin and stunned, spilled out and into someone's arms. They were waking those creatures with human hands, and as each animal came free, the crowd made a small, grateful sound that was not quite a cheer. The man's tabby was taken from its cell and placed at his feet, purring a thin, mechanical song. But the tempers did not settle. A phone buzzed and someone put it to the supervisor's ear. He listened and then paled as if the voice on the line had carried thunder. He hung up and his face changed. "There is a complaint lodged with the municipal inspectorate," he said. "But more people are watching this. There are cameras in other streets. This could escalate." "Let it escalate," Amina said. "Let it rain light if that is what it takes." The supervisor's eyes cooled like iron that has cooled after being held to flame. "If this goes public in a certain manner," he said, "we must protect the process. We cannot have vigilante action. The law does not, mother," the man interrupted. "The law keeps books." It was then, amid the clang of words and the small urgent sounds of animals being accounted for, that a woman moved through the gate. She came as people who have done dangerous things come, with a foot half in old habit and half in a new reckoning. The scar on her cheek caught the light like a small wound for others to see. She walked toward them with the slow confidence of someone who had carried the weight of something she could not surrender. She did not stop to practice innocence. She had none to offer. Her hands were small and clasped in front of her like one who holds an argument. "I did what I had to do," she said without preface. Her voice was neither soft nor shrill. It was the voice of someone who knows the price of a necessary thing. Around her the yard stilled, because there are moments where all human noise understands the shape of a moral question and refrains. "Why?" the man asked. He had thought of her many times, watched her in the grainy footage, wondered at the quickness of her movements. Her actions had looked like abandonment. Now she stood within the compound among the creatures she had handled. She looked at the crates. "Because they told me to," she said simply. "Because the orders come packaged as efficiency. Because there are instructions and they make you follow them or lose your job, and jobs are short rope when you have children. But sometimes the orders went further. Sometimes we were told to clear certain areas, to move animals to sites where no rehoming happens. I could not," she faltered, the first human crack appearing. "I could not watch them put down without asking questions." "What questions?" the man said. "Where would they go?" she answered. "Who would take them? Who decided which lives were worth the expense of keeping? I left them where someone might find them, where someone might care." A silence folded like linen. The woman's confession performed a soft miracle. She had not been a villain, but the inside hand of a complicated machine. Her scar had not been the mark of an inhumanity, but the record of a life that had been forced into a bargain. Her face in the sun showed the array of small absences. A child not nearby, a room empty, a hand that knew how to tie knots. People murmured. Some were angered by the deceit of municipal rules. Others felt the thin compassion of those who understand that arms can be forced. "You put them where they might be found," Amina said, and the words were not accusation but the naming of a strategy. "I hoped," said the woman, "I hoped someone would keep them." The man thought of the basil pot, of his wife's hands, of the way small things insist upon being tended. He thought of the woman's scar, and felt in it the geometry of hardship and shame and the strange fidelity of people who choose the lesser evil. He reached out and found himself wishing suddenly and fiercely to offer the woman an ordinary piece of mercy. "Then tell us everything," he said. "Tell us where they came from, who signed the orders, and we will make this public." She nodded, and as she began to speak, the world seemed to rearrange itself in the yard like a group of animals shifting for comfort. Names were spoken. There were others who had signed the paper. There were drivers who had followed orders. There were places where the animals ended up and men who were held to their salaries over conscience. The man listened and wrote what he could in his head as if memory might be a ledger that saves the small. And then, as they were about to leave the compound with the animals assessed and the woman promising testimony, a thin metallic noise rose from beyond the gates. The sound of engines turning, of doors being locked in a hurried cadence. The supervisor looked sharply toward the sky and his face became a map of dread. Someone in the crowd pointed upward. A line of vans headed their way, more municipal vehicles rolling like a tide. The yard's small victory contracted in the face of method. The man felt the animal in his arms press close, small heart pressing against his own. The supervisor barked into his radio and men moved with the purposeful, indifferent speed that officialdom possesses when it decides that a problem is to be contained rather than solved. The first of the incoming vans rolled to a stop. The doors opened and from them stepped men in a different uniform, a uniform of contractors, gray and practical. The supervisor stiffened. "They are here for reinforcement," he said, but his face was a ledger with a new, sharp item, orders from higher than him. The man looked at the woman with the scar, and for a moment he saw the whole knot. She had been caught between a bureaucracy that uses bodies to tidy aisles and her own small attempts at mercy. The incoming vans meant either an escalation into an ugly show of force or an attempt to reabsorb the matter into process. The crowd tightened like a rope stretched too far. One of the contractors stepped forward and spoke in a voice that was both low and disciplined. "By order of the municipal office," he said, holding a folded paper in his hands like a shield, "we are to remove these animals pending a full audit. The area is to be cleared. Those who resist will be charged with obstruction." A wave of something cold crawled up the man's spine. The paper in the contractor's hand looked official. The neighbor with the live stream crouched and recorded. The animals in their crates made small noises, as if aware that their future was being argued like an account. He felt the press of a moment that divides men, to submit to an authority that may be unjust, or to stand and perhaps lose everything. He saw in the faces of those who had come from the lane a bright, sudden hunger for truth. He thought of his wife's basil and how small plants bend toward light. He thought of the woman with the scar and how she had used small, dangerous kindness to subvert a cruel instruction. He thought also of the pile of papers still in his pocket, of petitions and signatures, of public comments and human faces. The man stepped forward. He placed the crate with his tabby on the ground and turned toward the contractor. "If you take these animals," he said quietly, "then you take the evidence. If you take the animals, there will be nothing left to show what was done and by whom. You will simply make the problem vanish from view." The contractor's eyes were steady and used to the small music of authority. He replied with the voice of iron. "We have orders," he said, and the words were small armor. "Orders," the man repeated. He swallowed. He wondered, with something like awe, if any one man's insistence could be enough to force a beam of light through such a thunderhead of procedure. He thought of his wife's steady hands and the way she would have boiled tea for troubled men, without asking for credit. He thought of the cat, which had come to him by accident and then pressed itself into the geometry of his days. He was no soldier. He was a keeper of small things who had learned slowly the taste of responsibility. "What would you have me do?" he asked. And though the question was a simple one, the men around him felt its gravity. This is the moment the story had been building toward. The small man standing before a larger machine, the lean of human compassion against the arc of official will. The answer might be a protester's shout, a lawyer's paperwork, a crowd's fury, or it might be silence. He made his choice not in rhetoric but in motion. He walked toward the nearest crate and set his hands upon it. He opened it and, with the solemnity of someone at an old rite, lifted from the straw a cat that was thin and tremulous. He set it against his chest so that the animal's small rate of breath matched his own. "If you take them," he said, looking the contractor in the eye, "you will take them over my dead body." The contractor's hand twitched. Around him voices rose, some pleading, some angry, some frightened. The supervisor looked at him with an expression that is called complicit calculation. Men from the contractor's vans moved forward, their hands ready not to touch animals but the human who obstructed their path. Somebody from the crowd shouted, "Would you arrest an old man for protecting a life?" It was then that a small sound came from the man's pocket, the sound of the live stream pinging. A new comment scrolled across the neighbor's phone and a question blossomed into the air, delicate and terrible. Would you stay if you were in their place? The man heard the question as if it had been asked to his own chest. He pressed the trembling cat to himself and felt its pulse, a thin, stubborn drum of life. Around him, men moved like chess pieces. Contracts and orders folded into the shape of force. The contractor's eyes flicked to the supervisor, then to the pile of animals. The supervisor made a calculation with the speed of a man who weighs consequences and the glare of public attention. This, then, was the decisive moment. Whether the weight of law and complicity would overwhelm the small, human, stubborn thing he had chosen to defend, or whether the light of public witness and a neighborhood's determination would shift the balance. The man's hands tightened on the cat as if to make his choice into a fact. The contractor stepped forward. The supervisor opened his mouth. The woman with the scar straightened as if bracing for a witness stand. The van engines idled like heartbeats in the background. The yard closed its breath. The man with the tabby warm against his chest looked once more at the faces around him. The volunteers, the neighbors, Amina, the supervisor, the contractor. He thought of the basil at his window, and the memory of a hand that had taught him to care. He thought of the envelope, of the petition, of a city that could be made to choose its better habit if enough people would hold up a light. He raised his head and spoke in a voice that, to his own surprise, had the steadiness of the shore. "If you take them today," he said, "the story ends in a crate. If you let them go, perhaps it will be a beginning." He did not know whether the men before him would let him pass, whether the contract of orders would stand like an iron wall. He simply chose. He had kept small things before. Now he kept a whole ledger of witness. The contractor's hand hovered as if over a switch. The supervisor sighed as if over a ledger. A siren faint in the distance might have been a neighbor calling for patience or a recorder in the city, reacting to the feed. For a moment the world paused in a way that felt like mercy. Then the contractor moved. Would you stay if you were in their place? When the men in gray paused at the gate, the lane exhaled as if someone had at last opened a long-closed window. The day that had begun with a thin envelope and a smashed camera had widened into an argument that no single hand could settle. Voices multiplied like small creatures at a door, some quick to condemn, some slow to forgive, some eager for spectacle, some intent on repair. In the press of that moment, the old man discovered a new currency: other people's attention. It arrived messy and unexpected, a torrent that could drown or could irrigate. The cats in crates sounded like a single throat. Their small noises stitched the crowd into a common pulse. The woman with the scar, who had once moved like someone paying for a fear, now faced what she had concealed with the courage of confession. Men in suits counted rules while neighbors counted names. The man felt for the first time since the basil had been his wife's that his life was not wholly private but part of a larger habit, the city as a community that could either remember or forget. He stood in the middle of a crowd that wanted answers, and in that expectant hush he realized that whatever came next would shape not only who kept the animals, but how a small lane might keep its own soul. What followed the stand at the compound came like weather. Not a single storm, but a succession of small shifts that, compounded, remade the shape of their neighborhood's life. The contractors, their orders held up like a paper shield, retreated when the crowd tightened, and the supervisor found himself pressed between procedure and publicity. Someone unrolled a petition, and a neighbor read a list of signatures until the sound of names became a kind of ledger for conscience. The woman with the scar, whose hands had once been quick and furtive, sat beside the man on the low step outside the gate, and confessed to what she had done and why. Her speech unfolded without flourish, a mixture of fear, necessity, and a stubborn, private generosity. She told of drivers ordered to clear districts at night, of supervisors who signed without thinking of the lives being carried in crates, and of the small revolt that had been her own, an attempt to spare life by placing it where it might be found. The supervisor, who had arrived believing administrative language could suffice, discovered that language had become thin when measured against the weight of living beings. There were calls to higher offices, murmurs of audits, and the uncomfortable clink of brass, officialdom aware it might be seen. The reporter who had once pressed for a tidy story returned, notebook replaced by the steadier weight of an eyewitness. He listened and wrote, and his words later moved through the city like a tide, not violent but insistent. Citizens who had no particular stake in the lane found themselves reading of crates and signatures and wondering whether the public machines that sorted minor lives were themselves humane. Legal presence came next in a form neither expected. An inspector with an ancient face and a patience that might have been born of long acquaintance with small cruelties. He read the petition. He examined the tags on the crates, and he asked for records in the way of someone who believes process must serve truth, not bury it. His voice had the tone of a man who had seen the city's underarches and known where damp collects. He called for an immediate temporary injunction. The animals were to remain under observation at the compound, but with a mandate that their conditions be improved, that evidence be preserved, and that a public audit be scheduled with a date and a time that could not be postponed by petty paperwork. The contractors bristled. They had been paid to follow orders, and orders do not like to be postponed. Yet the presence of an inspector, documentary proof, and public attention made postponement costly. In the hours that followed, the man and Amina and a cluster of volunteers shifted from the posture of protest to the practical mechanics of care. They drew up lists of the animal's apparent needs, shared the vet's notes, and arranged a rota to visit the compound and tend to wounds that the municipal system had promised to treat, but had not yet addressed. They wrote in sharp, honest language the catalog of what must be done: defleeing, nourishment, veterinary review, and assessments for rehoming. Small acts of kindness brought food, a blanket, a gently washed crate, were performed with the quiet dignity of ritual. The crate that had once held the man's tabby was placed near a window to catch the sun, and the cat, thin and wary, began to breathe with the ease of a creature no longer counting the hours to an unknown end. There were consequences for those who had hidden cruelty beneath procedure. The inspector's audit did not merely produce papers, it produced names. The signatures on the petition that the clerk had given to the man were traced back to a series of internal directives. It turned out that a small group within the municipal office had reinterpreted an efficiency policy into practices that removed animals from certain neighborhoods and transported them to distant processing sites where rehoming prospects dimmed. An internal memo, careless and raw with authority, revealed that the purpose had been to clear perceived problem areas. The language was clinical and the result was brutal. Public outrage, once stoked, does not easily befriend the bureaucracy that hides behind neat language. The inspector recommended disciplinary measures, and while the administrative machine moved slower than a man's urgency, the first lines of accountability were drawn. The woman with the scar became unexpectedly a pivot for mercy. Her testimony, given with blunt admissions and a steady voice, allowed the inspector to understand not merely the fact of wrongdoing, but the texture of how it had been justified to workers who feared losing wages more than they feared wrong. She spoke of being given lists, blocks that required clearing, with the implication that animals left would be dealt with by municipal mechanisms she now understood had been misused. Her confession, raw and humble, made it clear she had acted not from malice but from a divided loyalty. That confession pressed into the heart of the problem. Systems function through the hands of flesh who can be coerced by hunger and habit. Addressing the system therefore required addressing those hands. The inspector recommended not only penalties but training, oversight, and the establishment of humane protocols, a small bureaucratic architecture meant to ensure safety and prevent future private decisions from doing public harm. The man watched all of this with a careful attention that had become part of him. He had once arranged his life around small acts: the basil, the cup of evening tea, the sweep of the lane. Now his days gathered new errands, calls to the inspector, lists of potential foster homes, a rota for visits. He was not a man of grand gestures. His moral register was the modest one of small repairs. Yet ministry of a different sort unfolded in him. He found voice in the town meetings that were hurried into being, and his words, simple, direct, and sometimes brittle with grief, wielded a slow power. He described the cat that had come to his step, the basil that had been his wife's, and the small arithmetic of love that asks a man to be present. His testimony was less about law and more about the quietness of care. He argued that the city's ledger should include tenderness. The reporter's column, when it appeared, did not seek sensation so much as it sought a thread. It wove the petitions, the signature-laden paper, the woman's confession, the inspector's recommendations, and the man's bedside vigil into a narrative that the city could not ignore. It forced the municipal office into public hearings where officials had to speak before citizens who had read and cared. The pressure of daylight and the unflinching smallness of many voices produced an effect the man had not expected. The municipal council voted to establish an independent review board composed of citizens, a few veterinarians, and 2 members of the community. The board's mandate was strict: transparency, humane treatment, and paths to rehoming. It was not a cure, but it was a structure that could hold a cure if carefully tended. In private, the man discovered the arithmetic of change. He counted the hours he spent at the compound and found his sleep thinner and his days longer. But he also felt a strange replenishment. The cat, whose presence had been the fulcrum of the whole affair, began to show a softness that made the man's old loneliness feel less like a sanctioned thing and more like a chapter. He would stand against the compound yard's low wall and talk to the tabby, the words slipping out like seeds, small, true sentences that did the humble work of mending. The cat listened, sometimes blinking as if in sympathy. Once it nipped his sleeve in a manner that suggested power to forgive. The basil at home stood greener than before, as if it too had been buoyed by the tides of attention. The plant had lived through grief once. Now it learned to live through change. In these small interactions, the man grew quieter but deeper. He learned to answer the world not with a ledger of losses, but with a ledger of care. Neighbors changed too. Rafi, who had once complained about smells and pigeons, signed the petition. His signature was a small thunder for the man, an indication that even reluctance can be nudged into mercy. Those who had been quick to judge found themselves admitting in low tones that they had not imagined how the municipal machine might have been used. The tea woman, who had always had more heart than judgment, sat by the man and brewed a pot each afternoon for volunteers. The fishmonger, who liked sharpness and taste, brought a battered tin of sardines for the crates, and when he saw a cat lick its whiskers with that face of small earned joy, he nodded as if tasting something like redemption. The live stream had been a double blade. It had invited mockery and cruelty at first, but it also made things visible. Where cameras had been smashed undercover, new cameras, this time owned by neighbors who wished not to exploit but to prevent, appeared like a cautious network. The community installed a simple recorder in a shared space. It was there to document any future abandonment attempts and to protect the lane's small lives. The man, who had once relied upon the municipal camera as his private ledger, found himself part of a group that watched for cruelty and reported it to proper authorities and proper channels. Some practical matters required compromise. The inspector recommended that the municipal office open a humane shelter downtown with transparent policies. It required funds and trust. The municipal council voted through an initial budget line, accompanied by a promise to hire a humane officer. The contractors whose vans had been implicated faced internal review. Some were reassigned, others disciplined. For those who had acted under orders, the inspector proposed training and, in some cases, restitution to the community. It was not a sweeping justice. The machine of the city is heavy and slow, but the gears had shifted, and the sound of them moving was better than the silence of indifference. Healing happened in increments. The man's tabby regained a fullness of fur and a patience that belonged to a creature who knows it will be fed. The woman with the scar, who had once been ashamed to show her face, found small forgiveness in acts of service. She began to work at the nascent shelter, her hands steadying in the new rhythm of tending. She learned to stitch a crate cover with a patience that matched the man's own. The man himself learned to sit with others whose hands had been forced and to offer not only scorn, but the possibility of repair. He learned that justice sometimes requires both the firm hand of accountability and the soft hand of rehabilitation. At nights when the man walked the lane, the basil at his window smelled of memory and new beginnings. The pot, a green argument against forgetting, had become a small symbol among neighbors, a reminder that tending matters. The man would sweep the corner in front of it as a daily benediction and pause to watch the cat, now named Mallow by a small boy in the lane, curl at his feet. The name itself, chosen by a child who thought it sweet, became a public tenderness. Names, the man had learned, are small sovereignties. To name is to claim a relationship that resists disposal. Yet not all threads were cleanly tied. Some municipal elements resisted change and grumbled in offices. The contractors still grumbled about interruptions. The inspector found himself fighting complacency in committees that languished. The man who had once been content with small domestic order discovered that public life requires stamina and at times irritation. He had to learn that advocating for animals meant engaging with meetings and forms and voices that preferred order to compassion. It was a new strain upon him, but it was work that left him less hollow. One particular thread paid off in a way as plain and as profound as sunlight on a leaf. The camera that had been smashed and which had first told their small tale had not been the only recorder. A neighbor had, days earlier, saved a fragment of footage before the device was crushed. She had done so because small memories had value and because she suspected something wrong. The fragment, enhanced with care, revealed additional detail. The woman with the scar placing a bundle, the van's plate, a timestamp that matched the municipal log. That footage, when presented before the public hearing convened by the inspector, was a nail in a box. It allowed the council to call for further transparency and, crucially, it spared the woman from bearing the brunt of accusation alone. The evidence transformed a rumor into a case. At the hearing, the man spoke not merely as a keeper, but as a witness to what kindness can be. A concrete, stubborn thing that costs one something and pays the community with something else. Stability. Example, a neighbor who will answer the night. He spoke of his wife's basil and how small things insist upon care. He told of the cat that had come in the silence after grief and had, in returning company, returned him a kind of life. The words had no legal force, but they had moral force that galvanized others into action. The hearing ended with resolutions. In order to establish humane intake procedures, a fund to support community fosters, and a commitment to public reporting of municipal animal handling. People who had been passive became active in small ways that made large differences. The school organized a drives of kindness. Children made small beds for rescued animals in their art classes. The tea woman organized a rota for delivering food to the compound until the shelter opened. The man found in these small acts a kind of community that had been latent but not yet summoned. He was surprised at how his own life had been reshaped. The man who had once only swept leaves now taught a small class in humane handling at the community center, where he spoke with a soft voice and an authority born of action. And so, by degrees, the immediate crisis passed into a new ordinariness. Crates were emptied not by van doors slamming in the dark, but by hands that lifted animals into carriers headed for the new shelter. The woman with the scar worked as a volunteer. The contractors were audited. The supervisor was admonished publicly. The inspector's recommendations were inscribed into ordinance, and the city, grudgingly at first, began to be a little less proud of its secret efficiencies and a little more conscious of its duty toward the small lives it affected. In these unfolding days, the man's own interior altered. He found himself less given to stoic silence and more capable of asking for help. He accepted offers to watch the cat from neighbors who wanted to be involved. He wrote thank you notes to those who had signed petitions and to the inspector who had listened. He learned that asking for help did not make him lesser. It made possible a web of mutual care that was stronger than his solitary competence. He still swept the lane each morning, but now he swept with other hands. Neighbors who had learned that to sweep a communal space is to restore something larger than the ground. Occasionally, in the cool of night when the lane was quiet and the basil tossed leaves in a small wind, the man would sit and count the tones of a life rearranged. He thought of the camera smashed and of the fragment saved, of the envelope that had started the wider conversation, of the tabby who warmed his thighs, of the woman who had been forced into compromise and had chosen to become a keeper. He felt the small, brittle complexity of human systems and the stronger, softer resilience of people who choose to amend them. The lane was not wholly healed. No place that has lived through neglect is perfectly whole. But it had been nudged toward a habit of attending. The man had not become a hero. He had become a keeper with a wider remit. Has an animal ever changed your life in a way you didn't expect? The man would later ask in a soft voice at a community meeting, and hands would go up, some hesitant, some eager. Stories unfurled. A dog who returned a lonely man to the world, a caged bird whose song taught a child patience, a cat who curled against an elder's knee and removed the sharpness from loneliness. Each confession was a small gift to the meeting. Each story deepened the sense that tending is contagious. The falling of events had delivered payoffs for early plants. The basil that his wife had tended had, through the cat's habit of sleeping by it, become a public emblem of the quiet persistence of care. It was placed on the table at the hearing as if to remind those who make ordinances that life is not only paper and policy, but green things that respond to hands. The camera's fragment redeemed the broken surveillance into a tool for justice rather than voyeurism. The envelope that had once induced fear became proof that small acts of record-keeping can change the course of municipal habit. When the immediate dust settled, when orders had been rewritten and the shelter finally opened its small doors, the tabby Mallow came home with the man in a way that felt less like taking and more like an agreement. The man had learned to care in broader measure. The community had learned that small vigilance can tilt a city. The compounds of law had been challenged. The hands that worked them had been asked to answer. And the lane had kept a new covenant. It would not let its small creatures be hidden away. In the final quiet of those weeks, the man, who had once kept only the memory of his wife and a pot of basil, kept now a roster of small duties and an expanded heart. He had become, in the patient way of things that last, a different kind of guardian. One who knew that law must sometimes be pushed and that mercy must be organized. The falling action of their struggle closed not with triumph but with the steady, modest progress of a place learning to be kinder. And in that learning, in the ordinary acts that stitched the public to the private, the neighborhood discovered something that would not fit tidy reports, a truth about small lives and large responsibilities, about how attention can be a kind of shelter, and how people, when they choose, can be better than the systems that bind them. In the hush after the hearings, the lane learned to breathe differently. Sunlight came not as accusation but as an instrument of mending. It fell on crates now emptied, on a basil pot that seemed to hold memory like rain, and on doorsteps where people paused to speak kindly. The man who kept the quiet had found himself folded into a shape he had not planned for. Not merely a solitary keeper, but a center from which small ripples extended. Mallow, whose thin ribs had once been visible beneath dust, slept with the abandon of a creature that has been granted a second arrangement of days. Children who used to run past the stoop stopped to press their palms to the cat's warm fur. The municipal files had layered themselves with new ink. Policies were being written by people who had once ignored the small lives in alleys, and the woman with the scar had learned to be a steward rather than a secret. In that new breathing of the lane, an ancient truth settled like comfortable shawl over shoulders. That a single small act can, if held, change the shape of a neighborhood's heart with quiet, certain grace. The city does not unlearn its habits in a week, nor does a lane fix itself by a single goodwill. Change comes like a careful stitch, made by many hands and set with small, repeated tenderness. In the weeks that followed the hearing, the man found his days occupied in a new ledger. Appointments, calls to the nascent shelter, conversations with volunteers, and visits to the municipal board where men and women in suits learned the awkwardness of being observed. He discovered that good work is not always glamorous. There were stacks of forms to file, meetings that stretched into evenings, and long, polite calls that felt as if they were all mouth and little bite. But in the hidden arithmetic of things he had once counted, teacups, basil leaves, sweepings, he now found the slow accrual of difference, a vet appointment that actually happened, a crate that received clean straw instead of neglect, a record that bore both names and consequences. Mallow settled into the rhythm of domestic life with a reliability that surprised the man. Recovery for animals and for people is a slow weather. A day's sun does not itself make a green thing grow, but a sequence of suns will coax it out of the soil. The cat's coat regained a sheen. The wound behind its ear closed like a small story told properly. Its purr became a regular meter in the man's house, a small drum that marked breakfast and dusk as if to say that the world had been reconciled on a practical level. Children taught Mallow to accept pats. A neighbor brought a soft blanket for his basket. The tea woman started to put out a little saucer of milk in the afternoon. Small mercies gathered and the man felt lighter, not because his grief had fled, but because it had been joined to new work with others. The woman with the scar, whose furtive acts had started the whole conversation and whose conscience had brought her into the light, began, almost as if she were paying rent for the kindness she had once undermined, to work at the shelter. She learned how to clean wounds without flinching, how to read a cat's squint as either pain or mere irritation, and how to bind a paw with steady fingers. There was humility in her labor. She could not take back the nights she had chosen to drop bundles, but she now chose to stitch open the same places she had once closed. People in the lane watched her transform. The boy who had once thrown stones now brought old towels. The fishmonger, who had only recently learned to admit small contrition, started to leave a jar of sardines for the shelter's rationing. The municipal office moved with the heavy reluctance of its nature, but it moved. The inspector's temporary injunction became a series of policy revisions. Clearer intake procedures, transparent logs, a reassignment of vans with better oversight, and a modest budget allocation for the new Humane Intake Center. There were items on lists, cameras at points where abandonment had been likely, a hotline that connected citizens to an officer trained in animal welfare, and an order that any contractor involved in animal collection must receive training and signed acknowledgement of humane procedures. The council debated. The men who had once preferred the neat lines of efficiency grumbled, and yet signatures appeared on paper that had formerly only carried the weight of indifference. A few contractors who had knowingly crossed the line were disciplined. A few clerks who had been too eager to tidy neighborhoods without considering the living were reassigned. Some were forgiven and trained. In the balance, there were neither villains hung up like trophies, nor saints crowned without work, only men and women asked to do better. The Gelk, fragment of footage saved by a neighbor, became the hinge upon which this reform rotated. It was shown at the hearing and then at a public forum. The clarity it gave removed the fog of rumor and forced the municipal apparatus to answer with fact. Evidence, though not a cure in itself, opened a door. When people could see the path of the van, the place of the bundle, and the face of the woman, and then see her confess and then sit stitching blankets at the shelter, the city had to accept both blame and remedy. The public that had once watched with the scattershot cruelty of comments now watched with a deliberate will to keep things like justice lit. They attended meetings and signed petitions and knitted beds. The live streams that had once been a spectacle became, for a time, a kind of civic brush that prodded the municipality to be both just and honest. In time, the lane's vigilance turned to the practical sovereignty of neighborhood care. For the man, the transformation was both outward and inward. He had been a man who had learned to hide in the small certainties of daily practice. Now he found a new habit that did not require solitude. He taught a weekly class at the community center called Keeping as Craft, short lessons on first aid for animals, how to make a simple carrier from a box and ropes, the behavioral cues of fear in cats, and the small ethics of stewardship. He spoke plainly about grief, about how the basil pot had been a way to touch a wife's memory without making it a shrine. People came, young men who wanted to know how to be kind, an elderly woman who had once kept parrots and wished to return to the work, and a cluster of children whose hands were small and eager, and who called the man uncle because small words build families. He learned to accept help. Neighbors taught him how to fill forms and where to find a certain paper that moved municipal hearts more quickly. He discovered a joy that is not the eruptive delight of the young, but the steady warmth of someone who has found a purpose that keeps him honest. Life at the shelter became its own small ecosystem of repair. Mallow was a regular guest, as though to remind the place why it existed. The shelter was modest, a converted warehouse with skylights and painted walls, crates that had been cleaned and lined with blankets, and a board where names were pinned as if to keep memory from being light. Volunteers rotated. The woman with the scar supervised a class on humane handling. The man visited often, bringing tea the tea woman had brewed, offering a quiet steadiness that steadied others. He would sit with an anxious mother cat and hum the soft rhythms he had once hummed to a wife's slumber. People watched him, and sometimes a stranger offered a hand simply because to give is itself an act that breeds more giving. There is in every story of small things a test of endurance. Will the novelty of outrage subside into private apathy, or will oversight become a built habit? The lane worked in daily smallness to ensure it was the former. A neighborhood committee was established to oversee municipal animal dealings. It met monthly and produced minutes that were public. An independent auditor was appointed for the new Humane Intake Center and published a report with both commendations and criticisms. The man, called as a witness and then as an advisor, found that his voice, low and steady, counted in places where previously only raised hands had been heard. He was careful not to become triumphant. There are no roses without thorns. He knew that reform can rot if not tended, and so he attended the committees, sometimes weary, sometimes animated, but always present. Mallow's final gift to him was not a thing that could be filed or certified. It was a small, quiet miracle that had the solemnity of a parable. One spring morning, months after the fights and the hearings, Mallow disappeared for most of the day. The man waited, went about his errands, and grew anxious as the sun bent slow. At dusk, Mallow returned not alone, but bearing in his mouth a small green shoot, a tiny sprig of basil, its roots still clinging to a bit of earth. The cat dropped it into the man's hands as if returning a debt. The sprig had been taken perhaps from the shelter's small rehabilitation garden, or from a neighbor's pot. No matter. What mattered was the act. The creature who had been once abandoned now fetched a plant and delivered it, with deliberate purrs, into the palms of the man who had kept it. There are acts that carry a weight like law. This was not one of them. It was a private poem. The man knelt on the stoop, his knees making soft complaints, and planted the sprig in the original basil pot, the one that still bore the crescent chip his wife had liked. He pressed the soil with fingers that had once smoothed grief into order. Around him the neighbors slowed at their doors and watched, as if to learn what reverence might look like. A child left a handful of water at the pot's base, and the tea woman came to lay a damp cloth over the soil for the night. The sprig shivered its small green at the touch and then settled, as plants do, into the patience of photosynthesis. It was a tiny return, life returning to a man who had saved life, a symbol small but complete. The sprig grew, and from it came more leaves. The pot looked less like a relic than it had looked for many months. Folks began to speak not only of policy but of humility. In the market lane, the basil pot became a memorial to a small kindness that had changed a sequence. Children tied tiny cloth markers to the pot's rim with names of other animals saved. The pot became a tiny ledger of affection. The man sometimes caught himself speaking aloud to the little plant as if his wife were listening from the other side of things. It is in these private sentences that grief and hope are braided, and he found, in speaking to a sprig, the permission to keep both. The city's reforms kept being tested. A neighbor in another district reported an attempt at abandonment, and the hotline, newly created, spiraled the worker to the site. That report was different because it traveled through channels that had not previously existed. The municipal office had incurred both costs and the new discipline of being seen. Public pressure faded but did not disappear. A quiet vigilance persisted. The shelter's intake increased with a more humane triage and a list of fosters whose names were public. A small fund, seeded by local donations and a municipal grant, helped pay for spaying, vaccination, and transportation costs for animals found in need. The man watched these developments with a tempered satisfaction. The fight had not been for glory but for habit change. And habit change takes the shape of infrastructure. At neighborhood gatherings, they told the story the way stories are told to be kept alive, with slight variations, with warmth added where the heart had grown softer, and with the occasional laugh at the man's tendency to over-tidy. Children who had watched the early live streams came to the shelter to learn, and in doing so learned humility. They saw that to care is less a heroic act than a daily practice. In these small classrooms of life, an ethic of duty crept in like the warmth of afternoon. People learned the smallest of virtues, patience, routine, and the courage to speak up when witness is needed. The lane's moral architecture rearranged itself. Kindness entered its brickwork as mortar. If Rudyard Kipling had told this tale, he would have let the moral be simple but stern. Small lives matter. Small acts have weight. In the closing chapters, the man discovered that truth for himself and others, that agencies can be made to answer, that a woman with a scar can become a teacher of mercy, that a smashed camera can be replaced by vigilant citizens, that a pot of basil can be a testament to the work of memory and the practice of repair. The universal truth, when it arrives, does not thunder. It settles. It is like a pot of green on a stoop, quietly refusing to forget. When winter turned and the lane received a hint of the slow new year, the man walked the market at dawn and met the faces of those who had been part of the long mending. Amina, who had begun it all with a small tablet and a stubborn hand, was now an official volunteer coordinator. She stapled schedules at the shelter with the same precision she had used to pin down stray problems at their start. Mr. Qureshi, chastened and now more cautious, wrote a letter of institutional apology that, while awkward in tone, bore the honest weight of a man who had learned to see differently. The woman with the scar, who had once moved like a shadow at night, now walked openly, her hands busy with charity and stitches. The man who had been reluctant to begin anything found himself at the center of a new habit, a keepership that included not only his basil but a network of care. There remained, wisely, an element of caution. The man did not imagine that the city had been fully redeemed. Systems can revert, and the human heart can be careless again. He kept writing to the inspector when small irregularities came up. He taught new volunteers how to read a tag, how to administer a blistering dose of patience, and how to plant another basil sprig in case the first was lost. He would tell the story of the envelope that had arrived at his door in the van they had followed, not as a tale of victory, but as a manual of vigilance. He would say in his quiet voice at community meetings, "Tend your small things fiercely." He meant it both practically and metaphysically. The small things are, after all, the hinge, and on the final quiet and sunlit morning of the season, when the basil pot was full and the shelter's appointments were running on a schedule that pleased him for its steadiness, Mallow did something that would be told in the lane for years. He climbed to the man's lap as he sat with his tea and, with the casual dignity cats possess, he tapped the man's hand until the man took hold of his collar and read the small tag that had been placed there months ago, for safety and for names. On the tag, beneath the simple stamped words Mallow, someone had scratched in a child's looping hand, "Keep." It was a small imperative and a small prayer. The man smiled. He had kept. The community had kept. The city had been forced, reluctantly and then willingly, to keep its own promise to its smaller inhabitants. He looked around at neighbors, who had come to sit with their dogs, and to children with scratched knees, and saw that the final thread tied itself not with grand gestures, but with 1,000 small ones. Justice had not come like thunder, but like repair, slow, attentive, and patient. The universal truth hung there, plain and gentle as a morning. A society is known not by its monuments, but by what it refuses to throw away. The man stroked Mallow's head, feeling the cat's purr tremble through his palm like a small engine. Outside, the lane went about its day, vendors calling softly, a child running with a paper kite, a neighbor sweeping with the ceremonial care of one who knows the worth of small labors. You stayed with me till the very end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft purr in your heart, subscribing helps me share more stories like this.